It's the week ending Saturday the 9th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Trump supporters storming the US Capitol, where Democrats took the Senate for the first time in 4 years, and the UK heading back into another national lockdown as daily COVID deaths exceed 1,000 for the first time since the spring. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from The Week Junior, we have editor Felicity Capon. From Money Week, our resident guide through the financial fog, John Stepek. And we welcome back freelance writer Tomiwa Owolade. Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
And as party-like as one can be on Zoom, I feel. And starting us off this week with her party poppers afloat is Felicity. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week we learnt that Me Too is turning into Count Me Out?
On October 5th, 2017, the first article came out in the New York Times, and I was driving and I received a text from my sister. So this article came up, this Harvey Weinstein's face and accusations of, multiple accusations of sexual assault. I was stunned. I had no idea. And her next text was, you should tell your story.
Actress Caitlin Dunley talking to Woman's Hour on BBC Radio 4 on Wednesday, marking a year since the Weinstein trial. Felicity, I must say my heart sinks a little bit when Me Too reemerges in the news, because I think, like a lot of us, I sort of naively go around hoping that, well, as Woman's Hour was commemorating there, I guess, it was a historic event, Me Too, wasn't it? And you sort of hope that stories of sexual harassment now get reported. They're not covered up. There's nothing left to say. But of course, the real world's not like that, is it? And this week you bring us a story from Pakistan.
Yeah, so, as you were saying, this week is the 1 year anniversary of the Weinstein court case. He's serving a 23-year prison sentence in New York, found guilty of various rape and sexual assault charges. And this was kind of seen as the big culmination of the Me Too movement, which was started in 2006 by Tarana Burke, and it was a hashtag that was used more than 19 million times, mostly by women who wanted to share their stories of sexual abuse and harassment. And there was a big, as you just heard, Women's Hour, now presented by Emma Barnett, talked to Rosanna Arquette and Caitlin Dunley about their experience of it, and there was a big chat. And yeah, as you're saying, Ollie, it would be nice to think that magically this sort of thing no longer went on, but that's not the case. And I just thought it was very, very interesting to turn the attention to Pakistan, which has its own Me Too movement. And the latest development in the country is that the Pakistani film star Misha Shafi and 8 other people have been charged with criminal defamation for their alleged involvement in a smear campaign against a beloved singer-actor called Ali Safar. And so I thought it was interesting to bring it to the table and talk about the sort of status and legacy of the movement now.
Yes, you raised some scepticism about its legacy, which we'll talk about shortly. But first, Tom, so in Pakistan, the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, which was passed in 2016, was, at the time, announced as a measure to help protect women from online harassment, but it now seems to be being used to convict women.
Yeah, exactly. The actor Ali Safar is using something called the Federal Investigation Agency to charge any woman that's accused him of sexual abuse. So he's basically accusing all the women of defamation. And so you've got this strange situation where the women who've accused him of harassment are being put on trial at the same time as his harassment case as well is on trial. So you have 2 trials going on simultaneously.
But you also have trial by social media, don't you, John? Which, of course, is one of the things that Ali Zafar is objecting to in Pakistan. But the truth is, whatever happens in the courts and whether or not he can prove that he's been defamed and they don't have proof of harassment, if enough women come out on social media and say, it happened to me with this person, the court of public opinion comes into play, whatever country you're in.
Oh yeah, it does. That's always been one of the tricky things about the whole Me Too movement, is that it does open up the potential for, as you say, kind of trial by social media. None of that means that any of the the harassment isn't happening. It doesn't mean that it isn't there. It doesn't mean it's not a problem. And I have a tendency and an inclination to believe whenever women are talking about these things. But of course, that's precisely the problem, because that's why we have courts. Is why we have laws. It's so that people aren't kind of tried by mob, if you like. And I mean, I'll be absolutely honest with you, and I guess actually this speaks to one of the better legacies of the Me Too movement. I was surprised that anyone in Pakistan would dare to do this, quite frankly. I mean, maybe, don't get me wrong, I've not been keeping an eye on the country, but as far as, obviously my view of it, and I imagine lots of people's in the West, is that it's not probably the most female-friendly country in the world. And so it's quite surprising to me that there's any kind of Me Too movement at all. So I guess if you're looking for kind of positive legacies from the whole thing, then that might be one. The fact that these women are even happy to kind of come ahead and accuse someone who's clearly still popular. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the whole Harvey Weinstein thing was that he was like an alpha male who'd come to the end of his shelf life. That was as much about somebody's power kind of like being in decline, and then people seeing a chance, actually now there's an opportunity here to put right something that I couldn't do anything about, while he was at the height of his powers. Whereas as far as I can see, this guy's still extremely popular. So yeah, it's an interesting case, and it raises all the same issues that came about whenever it first kind of like came into the public eye, a good few years ago.
Okay, Felicity, so let's return to that note of scepticism that you sounded as you introduced the clip then. Is one of the concerns that's out there what Ali Zafar is saying? I've got a quote from him here. Anyone can come forward and accuse someone who's innocent and decent, has worked hard for over 2 decades, solely on social media. I mean, I guess however many women back up Misha Shafi's claims, he does have a point, doesn't he, as we were just saying? It's arguably unfair to try people in the court of public opinion.
Yeah, I agree with John. I mean, we should be wary of trial by Twitter, and Me Too did sort of take on a life of its own, where there were lots of accusations and allegations being posted. And in the interest of fairness, there does have to be legal recourse if you feel you have been falsely accused of something. I think with crimes such as rape and I think the sort of data suggests that it's the idea of women making this up and lying about it is like such a tiny amount as to be negligible. I mean, it happens, but very, very, very rarely. But then, of course, there were kind of murky areas where you had a lot of people saying, if I touch someone's knee, or I sort of clumsily try to make a pass at someone, and then all of a sudden I'm in hot water. So there were lots of conversations about that, and for example, Lionel Shriver, going back to the Emma Barnett show, she is a person who feels that Me Too went too far and was actually going to lead to a sort of breakdown between men and women and make men more paranoid and more hostile. I think I would say that you probably, when it comes to the more murky areas of men and women and how they interact around each other, there's probably opportunists on both sides. I sort of don't buy it when men say, "Oh, but how was I supposed to know this wasn't okay?" Because I sort of think I'm sure as humans we know what's okay and what's not okay. But then there will also be women who will try their luck of making a false claim that perhaps doesn't quite stand up.
Well, I suppose it's possible, isn't it, Tom, to think both things at the same time. You can feel sorry for someone who is in the same breath as rapists, being accused of sexual harassment for what might have been something drunken and clumsy and they thought was consensual. And it's difficult that there's this huge spectrum of different cases that get lumped into one hashtag. But it's also possible to think, crikey, I didn't realise how many people this affects. I mean, going back to 2017, think about my own Facebook feed. It's basically every woman I know posted a story, and it was only because this movement facilitated that conversation that they felt emboldened to say something that was seemingly insignificant, a hand on a knee, had happened to them and made them feel uncomfortable. And most men were walking around blissfully unaware that this is happening to women, and some men all the time.
Yeah, exactly, Ollie. I feel the same. I think it's possible to both think that the Me Too movement was absolutely necessary at the time, but also express some skepticism about some of the allegations raised. One thing that comes to mind was an allegation raised against the American actor Aziz Ansari, on a website called babe.net, and it seemed more of an accusation, or more of something akin to regrettable sex rather than sexual assault. So I think it's always important in those scenarios to try and separate instances of regrettable sex or miscommunication and sexual assault.
I suppose it's going back to power, isn't it? Which is the word you used, John, about Harvey Weinstein. It's the takeaway is often, I think, that you think, okay, stars are talking about this, celebrities, in this case in Pakistan, again, we're talking about movie stars, but it's about it's about for everyone else what the repercussions are, isn't it? And I suppose the lesson for a lot of us from the first Me Too round of stories was, okay, well, if this is happening in Hollywood, it's probably happening when, a manager of McDonald's is throwing their weight around. It's any man with power can do this.
Yeah, it is difficult because I would love to know what difference it has actually made. I thought your point there was really telling, Ollie. I mean, you're right. It didn't surprise me that much when it came out, simply because you're right. Pretty much every woman I know, or certainly the vast majority, have easily got stories along that line of being made to feel uncomfortable or shouted at in the street. And I don't mean wolf whistled. I mean something, not anything that anyone could ever find flattering in a million years. So it's clearly endemic. At the same time, whenever you think about your own behaviour, certainly from my point of view as a man, I don't really think that this is something that the majority of men are doing. I think it's it's surprising how few men it would take to harass an awful lot of women, I suppose, what it boils down to. High profile stuff like this, hopefully makes people think twice about it, makes people think twice about their interactions. Does it do anything for actual predators? I don't know if it'll change their behaviour. It'll certainly make anything that makes women feel more comfortable about coming forward is probably a good thing. So from that point of view, particularly for a country like Pakistan, where clearly it's, I suspect that sexism is more endemic than it is, say, in the UK, for example, and the kind of legal system is a little bit less reliable, then at least having some form of social pressure and some form of way to express this, even if it is just over social media, is probably a useful thing. It's not ideal, but anyway, I'll let you talk, Felicity. It looks as if you've got something useful to say.
I just wanted to jump on the point you were making, John, about it being high profile, because I think in some ways that's a double-edged sword in the fact that Harvey Weinstein has been so high profile, and the fact that these women in Pakistan are wealthy, high profile women is what has garnered so much attention. But equally, it does make you think, what about, especially in a country like Pakistan, what about those who are being harassed on the lowest rungs of society? And is the Me Too movement something that can be sort of transplanted into a country like Pakistan, which has a different context? For example, John was alluding to this earlier about like the sheer bravery of anyone kind of speaking up in a country like Pakistan. 1,000 women are killed each year by their families over damaged honour, and that can include violations like clapping and singing with boys. I think Prime Minister Imran Khan once expressed his doubts about feminism. Muslim scholars prescribe non-marital intimacy as haram, and families avoid having conversations about, sex and consent and all that sort of thing. So I think it's just sort of bearing in mind that sometimes when it is the very, very high profile people who have the privilege and the platform to talk about these things, just how many countless voices are not being heard, that I find that really worrying.
So is it a celebrity's duty in a country like Pakistan to use their platform to raise these issues? Or does it seem like privilege? Does it seem like something actually that they can talk about because they haven't got any other concerns and the rest of the country has bigger concerns?
I don't think it's anyone's role or duty. I think it's entirely down to the individual about if they're going to speak up about, what they've experienced. I wonder whether it's more a case of governments and institutions and is it about implementing sex education programs in schools, and rather than leaving this down to individual women, is this about creating a society which is better at saying this won't be tolerated this isn't acceptable behaviour. I mean, the law in Pakistan has been invoked in this, the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. I mean, that's used by the Pakistani government to censor online content and to access user data and criminalise some forms of communication. So the government also has a part to play in this.
I wonder as well, just finally on this, Tom, whether the term Me Too is an appropriate catch-all for what we're describing here, which can run that spectrum from kind of, unwanted sexual attention right the way through to violent rape. Because, as Felicity said, it's actually been going since 2006, which I didn't realise. Most social media things are kind of a flash in the pan. They represent a moment, but this is bigger than that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also a global movement as well. It's not just in Pakistan. You also have Me Too movements in Africa, in South America, which has been plagued for decades by acts of femicide, women killing. So it's, and I think it reflects the fact that social media movements or movements that start with social media, because of the nature of our increasingly globalized and interconnected social media, these movements are now global, and they speak to global concerns about sexual abuse against women, and not just sexual abuse against women, because if I'm correct, the Me Too movement in Pakistan started with the killing of a 7-year-old girl called Zainab Ansari in January 2018. So it's not strictly about sexual abuse, but gendered abuse. And also, I should also say it's also about abuse against men as well, because, of course, Kevin Spacey was accused of sexually abusing young men as well. So it speaks to the interconnected and globalized nature of social media allows these movements to reach a global audience.
Thank you. Okay, Tom, you're up next after this. Okay, Tom, your turn. What's your story from this week?
The disappearance of Jack Ma and Hong Kong democracy.
This is the moment police came for a former Hong Kong legislator. All across the city, more doors were being knocked on, more charges read out. The crackdown had begun. More than 1,000 police officers moved to arrest scores of pro-democracy activists. This was the biggest operation to date under the national security law, imposed by Beijing on Hong Kong last year. Many had feared the law's sweeping powers, and these were sweeping arrests. Arrests that included the first foreigner to be detained under the law, a US human rights lawyer.
Continue to work for democracy and human rights in Hong Kong.
The charge, subverting state power.
Tom Cheshire reporting for Sky News on Wednesday. So, Tom, this is the arrest of dozens more pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong.
Yeah, so over 50 pro-democracy activists and politicians were arrested on Wednesday. And they were arrested under the national security law that was introduced in June of last year in Hong Kong. And I think the justification for the arrests was that last year the pro-democracy politicians hosted an unofficial primary election to increase their share in the Hong Kong Parliament, in the Legislative Council. And Beijing, the Chinese government, accused them of subversion. So they were arrested under trying to subvert the parliament in Hong Kong.
I'm spotting a theme developing here, Felicity. So Pakistan is using an electronic crimes act that was designed to protect women, to arrest women, and China is now using legislation designed to protect the government in Hong Kong from opposition politicians.
Well, I mean, just from on a legal footing, it seems completely ridiculous that, I mean, it just begs the question, what they were doing was wanting to hold a poll, and that's unlawful. But even establishment parties that are backed by Beijing have held their own primaries. So I feel they're getting themselves tied up in knots. I mean, obviously there are far more sinister and troubling ramifications of all this, but it just seems on the actual thing for what they're being accused of is ridiculous and hypocritical. My other concern is that I feel the reason this is on this podcast, is that it is kind of flying under the radar, and it really, really shouldn't be. But I saw a tweet today, someone pointing out that the Chinese regime really knows how to choose their moment, and that, the US is completely preoccupied by their own internal chaos that's sort of engulfing the country, and this is sort of just quietly going on in Hong Kong, and it's really, really scary stuff, I think.
Yeah, from that point of view, John, I'm not saying you have to admire the Chinese for their clampdown of state power, but the protests were happening in Hong Kong like a year ago. We were talking about it then, and the Chinese made it very clear they did not approve of what was happening, but actually, I suppose compared to this, their reaction was quite mild at the time. They've waited, and I suppose the net effect of all of that is it means if you're an opposing campaigner in Hong Kong, you're just always scared. You never know when the knock on the door is going to come.
Yeah, and the problem with all this stuff is what do you do about it as well? This has been on the cards, or people have been worrying about it pretty much since Hong Kong was handed back over to China. And obviously nothing happened in the early years particularly. We get a slow creep, and certainly since the transfer of power to the kind of new kind of Chinese premier, China's been a lot more assertive in terms of demonstrating its authoritarian side rather than its cuddly capitalism with communist characteristics side. And so, yeah, you get, as you say, it's this kind of drip effect. And there's whatever Britain says and whatever America says, there is not an awful lot that anyone can actually do about this now, because there are so many issues that were at odds with China on. It's not just Hong Kong, it's Taiwan. It's kind of like there's the whole areas of the South China Sea. There's China coming up against India. It's just yet another kind of like series of China-related kind of power flexes that are impossible for anyone in the West to make a specific move on.
But we have particular skin in this game, don't we, Tom? Regarding the transfer of Hong Kong to China, as John was referring to there, we signed that act that China has now broken. Should the Prime Minister in particular, maybe even the Queen, be saying something beyond what they're doing at the moment?
I think they should. I think we should express more solidarity to Hong Kong, because it's part of China, but it has a degree of autonomy and a degree of political and civil freedoms, which is not found in mainland China. And those civil freedoms and political freedoms were shaped to a large extent by Britain. So I feel that we have a special responsibility to express solidarity with Hong Kong.
And to what extent does Brexit play into this, Felicity?
Well, yeah, I'm sure. Is there an argument to say it's put us in a slightly weaker position? And I think the EU's actually just been criticised for striking a trade deal with China, and some of these things slightly are brushed under the carpet, aren't they, when it comes to, especially now with the sort of everything going on with COVID and a global pandemic, these sort of like human rights abuses, I think to some people seem to take a back seat in what our preoccupations and our concerns should be. But I think that's really worrying.
But there's a difference as well, Tom, which is that this is the first time a foreigner has been detained under the new laws in Hong Kong. So, that can be interpreted as China sending a message to us and the world that nobody is excluded. So there's almost more need for us to respond, isn't there, to that? Like, what provocation are we going to continue to ignore?
That's a good point. Yeah, it was the American citizen that was detained under the law. But of course, America, as you said, America is going through its own crisis at the moment. So it's a case of, to what extent can we put pressure on China for its blatant subversion of democracy and human rights as well? Because of course you can also link this to its what we can essentially call a genocide against the Uyghur Muslims in China as well. I think there's a pattern now of China being more blatant in its abuse of human rights.
That's the problem. It's like, what do you do about all of this stuff? Britain, to be fair, has already basically said that there's an open door for Hong Kong nationals to come and emigrate here. This stuff does get condemned. I mean, Dominic Raab's been going on about it in between everything else for ages. And I mean, the other thing is, I mean, you're right, Felicity, the EU has just signed a trade deal with China because it's kind of like such an important customer for German cars. And that's the other issue. We've got a big kind of like economic power, a rising economic power, where everyone's simultaneously stuck in this mindset, oh, we've got to do business with China. And we're only just waking up to the fact that actually they're doing some pretty monstrous things and they're becoming more and more blatant about it. And certain countries are finding it harder to kind of balance that than others. And certainly, yeah, the thing with the EU is kind of a bit ridiculous this week, that they've just gone ahead and brushed everything under the carpet and just done this deal without, making any real kind of, rattling any cages about what's been going on.
Speaking of business in China, John, there's another component to this story, which is the founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma, has not been seen in public since October last year. Just tell us a bit about that. And, I mean, is there a connection between those two stories?
To be fair, there probably isn't a very explicit connection beyond China just getting more assertive about itself. Basically, what happened with Jack Ma? So Jack Ma is the equivalent of Jeff Bezos in China.
He's literally the richest man in China, is he?
Yeah, aye. If Jeff Bezos kind of like hadn't been on the telly or in the papers or seen in public for the last 3 months in the US, people would start to say, well, what's going on? So that's what's happened with Jack Ma. Now, this comes in the wake of, basically, he runs one of the most important payments companies. So it's not just the equivalent of Amazon. It's as if Amazon owned PayPal as well, and Visa, let's say.
Rather than running all their servers.
Exactly. Well, that's a good point. But anyway, so he was going to list this company separately. So it's called Ant Financial. And the day before, I mean, this was going to be the biggest listing of last year. It was a massive, massive stock market event. The day before, it got pulled because the Chinese authorities basically said, no, this isn't going ahead. Now, that was a massive move because China's obviously trying to open itself up to investment. And whenever when you turn around and say, okay, we've been planning this listing for X number of months, you've all got excited about it, or we're going to shut it down now, that's sort of telling global investors something very explicit, which is that the government is still more important than the markets, if you like.
So, Tom, where do we think Jack Ma is? We think he's still alive, right? It's just that he's keeping his head down.
Yeah. The view is that he's probably still alive, but is just keeping himself down. And in fact, Beijing basically scrapped Ma's company, the Ant Financial body, in December of last year. And I think that what John said about Ma is critical. He is like Jeff Bezos, but he's more sort of glamorous and charismatic than Jeff Bezos, and he was seen basically as sort of like a poster boy of China's soft power. He's been pictured with David Beckham, with Nicole Kidman. And I think it just shows the extent to which, no matter how rich or how much sort of cultural and social capital you have in China, if you speak out against the regime, you're always vulnerable.
Or maybe because he was a big star, Felicity. I mean, maybe that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a message coming from the Chinese Communist Party that, there's no one's bigger than us. There's no one individual. There's no one company that is. You can't just sort of go off and be bigger. You've still got to toe the line to some extent. I think it's sort of bullying tactics. And I mean, it's not without precedent. There's the superstar actress Fan Bingbing, she sort of dropped out of sight in 2018 and then sort of reappeared a year later to apologise for a tax evasion scandal. So it's happened before. And there was another tycoon, his name escapes me, but he criticised Xi for his handling of the pandemic, and he sort of disappeared a bit. So, I mean, I suppose the other thing to say is that we don't know where he is, and there's a lot of speculation, and maybe we should be wary of imposing. I mean, it's quite fun to speculate, isn't it? But maybe he's just taken an extended Christmas break, and I don't know. But
well, the giveaway was, though, John, he was supposed to be appearing on a TV talent contest, wasn't he? A sort of Celebrity Apprentice type thing. So it would be a bit weird that he was in the opening 2 episodes and just decided not to turn up to the final if it was all completely his decision.
It's as if Lord Sugar got fired just before the last episode of The Apprentice. I mean, to be fair, there's one issue here that makes this slightly more complicated, is that China's also it's got a very complicated juggling act because it has, it's basically promoted economic growth by making a lot of bad investments, and a lot of bad debt is floating around in its banking system. And it's been trying to reform its banking system for a good few decades and doing it gradually. The one thing with Ant Financial is that it is effectively a shadow bank. So if you want to think about it as being, like, say, the state effectively runs most of the banks in China, and this was a bank that was run by an entrepreneur. And so it does pose a big systemic risk to the Chinese financial system. So for it to be going off on its own and listing by itself would also have represented quite a big challenge to both financial stability and the power base. I mean, letting it get that far and then yanking it low is still a pretty clear message. You know, they could have had a word much earlier in the process.
Well, if this backstairs banking intrigue is wetting your whistle, then stand by, because John is up next with his choice of story of the week. Okay, John, you're finishing the show, so we've all got our accountant's green visor and solar-powered calculators at the ready. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It's the week the UK moved one step closer to the Weimar Republic.
And then it goes to the heart of the institutional structure of the Bank of England, which the Conservative government helped put in place, which is that you have independent committees of the bank that make these decisions. And what's critical, and I think my former colleagues are making clear, that they are independently making these decisions because they think for the pursuit of their monetary and financial stability objectives that these purchases, the quantitative easing, is the right thing to do.
Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, giving the Wreath Lectures, broadcast in December and available to stream on BBC iPlayer. John, have you located the government's magic money tree?
I have. It's been around for a while. No, this story, see, this is interesting because this is all about how money is created, and also how we think it's created kind of matters. So the thing that triggered this was that at the start of the year, the Financial Times published a survey, and they did a survey of 18 of the biggest traders in the UK government bonds market. And basically, they increasingly believe that the Bank of England is doing quantitative easing as a way to help the government fund its spending.
As opposed to what? Why are they supposed to be doing quantitative easing?
So,
because we know they're doing it.
They're supposed to be doing quantitative easing as a way to meet the country's inflation target. So
okay,
that sounds like semantics. To a great extent, it kind of is semantics. But the Bank of England, so the Bank of England's one job is to keep inflation in the economy at around about 2%. So that's its target. That's the only thing that it's told to do. Now, before 2008, it would have done that by lowering and raising interest rates, which is basically like, it's sort of regarded as a go faster or go slower lever on the economy. Now, when we came to 2008, interest rates fell to 0% because the banks were all bankrupt and we needed lending to go up in the country to support economic growth and all the rest of it. So they had to find a different way to keep interest rates down. So what they did is they started buying government bonds with money that they printed out of thin air. So that's quantitative easing. Now the whole point is that's still meant to be something. You're not. The argument has always been that that's not the equivalent of doing what they did in, for example, the Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe, because they're not printing the money and then handing it straight to the government and then the government's just spending it. What they're actually doing is printing money to buy long-term debt to keep interest rates down. And if you keep interest rates down, the idea is that we all go out and borrow money and spend more money. So you're not exactly printing money and then pumping it straight into the economy. Now the markets feel as if that's changing, and that's the key point. Because what's happened with coronavirus is the government has started spending lots of money to keep people employed with the furlough scheme, for example. Now, the Bank of England straight away started doing enough QE to pay for pretty much exactly the amount of extra borrowing that the government would need to do in order to spend that money.
But that's important, isn't it? I mean, if they hadn't done that, we'd be in trouble, wouldn't we? So, I mean, whether or not it's smoke and mirrors, it's valuable, right?
Oh yeah, it's valuable. There's no question about that. And it's probably the right thing to do. But the point is, it's much, much closer to the Bank of England just printing off a wad of notes and handing it straight to Rishi Sunak.
And that's not what's written in Latin on their motto. Okay. So there's
Exactly.
a bit of cloak and dagger stuff going on. I mean, Felicity, it's quite interesting, isn't it, that QE expansion in November was announced in tandem with the Chancellor's decision to extend the furlough scheme. Because, I mean, I remember actually watching the news at the time in November and thinking, oh, God, they obviously know we're going to be in some kind of lockdown this whole tax year. But at that time, of course, we were still 2 months away from that being announced. It's almost like if you want to know what the coronavirus recovery timetable is, you need to watch the Bank of England.
I thought the same thing. I remember when they were saying they were extending the furlough scheme, thinking, oh my God, we're, as soon as January swings around, we're back into lockdown again. It was like, it's sort of like they knew they were coming. I had the same kind of sinking feeling, and here we are. I think it's interesting because when I was looking into the story, and I'm absolutely no expert on these issues at all, but I mean, as John was saying, sort of at its most basic, it's sort of like, well, how are we going to pay for all this? Which I think is on a lot of people's minds, and it always makes me think of austerity. With these furlough schemes being rolled out, at some point, someone is going to have to pick up the bill, and a lot of people. There is all this debate about austerity and whether it wouldn't do much good anyway, because austerity just sort of suppresses demand and growth. So that's interesting. I feel like we're going to have so many more conversations about that. And then the other thing is whether about debt, whether it's government debt or small businesses getting into debt. There was an interesting piece on the radio earlier this week from a guy who is in charge of a chain of pubs up in the north, and obviously they've been closed throughout all the lockdowns we've had, and has borrowed something like 4 million, and he was sort of and it's going to have to borrow another million, I think. But he was expressing concern that unless that debt is written off, it's going to take his business years to fully recover. And are we going to need to get to the point where we are just sort of writing off debt?
Do you think that's possible, John, on both a government level and for small businesses, that debt is just literally written off?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's possible.
How? How would that work? I mean, if you're a small business, you borrow it from a bank. The bank just say you don't owe us that anymore. Where do they get the money from?
Well, it's worth looking at some of the things that the government's already done. So what you've got is, so Rishi Sunak calls it grants. And obviously a grant, it doesn't have to be paid back. So really what's happened is that certainly, for example, the most recent announcement of extending the lockdown. So now you're going to be able to get up to £9,000 as a small business in the retail sector, depending on the rateable value of your properties. But the point is, that money just gets handed out, so it doesn't have to be paid back. And then what happens is that, say, let's be optimistic and say half of those businesses end up going bust. It doesn't actually matter from a macroeconomic point of view. That £9,000 is still going into the system whenever it wouldn't have previously gone into the system. So on the one hand, that's inflationary, but it also shows you that we are much closer to the point where we are less concerned about things like debt and how it's going to be paid back, and just making sure that we get over this particular hump, which is probably the right thing to do, by the way, to be clear.
But what about, Tom, all those people that are working in retail who are going to lose their jobs, and they're then listening to speculation that the government gets to just write off its debt, and, big businesses get to write off their debt, but if you lose your job because the shop shuts, sorry, you're unemployed.
The government hasn't actually provided a comprehensive scheme or a way for all those people who've lost their jobs to in retail to get back.
Because they argue they can't.
Yeah, they argue they can't.
They argue, well, that's capitalism, there's nothing we can do. But they can bail themselves out.
Yeah, exactly. I think for many of them, their main concern, instead of quantitative easing or the Bank of England, is just waiting for the vaccines to appear and the vaccines to be rolled out by the government. So I think that's their main priority, rather than quantitative easing or the amount of debt that the government is trying to buy.
What do you think the consequences could be, Felicity, if the debt is just cancelled?
Well, I wonder whether it's with all of this, really, it's a confidence issue. I wonder whether you see a sort of a breakdown in, this was the story that John brought to the table about the survey, that there's sort of fear that it would sort of trigger a sort of alarming amount of a lack of confidence. I feel with so many of these stories that John brings, it is about consumer confidence and confidence in all this sort of thing staying the way it sort of has been up until this point. And I wonder whether there's going to be some sort of fragility there. I wonder whether the other thing, on a slightly more optimistic note, there was a great piece in the Financial Times about whether, if the vaccination programme is rolled out in the way the government intends it to be, whether you could see a consumer boom similar perhaps to the Roaring '20s, which followed after the Spanish influenza. I mean, obviously it sort of resulted in the Great Depression and the crash. But putting that to one side, will we see a sort of remarkable turnaround and spring back of lots of, not everyone of course, but quite a lot of people who sort of involuntarily have just been saving this whole time because they haven't been able to spend on things like holidays? Is there going to be a sudden huge consumer boost that might sort this all out a bit?
Well, in fact, your colleague, John Merrin Somerset Webb, was on the show a few weeks before Christmas saying indeed that was her prediction for what was going to happen. So can you give us some optimism to end with?
No, I think that is what's going to happen. I agree. For the furlough scheme and things like that, to be fair, Britain's done reasonably well in terms of pumping money into the system to try and keep us afloat. We're one of the better countries in the world from that point of view in terms of generosity. And so after this is done, a lot of people should have a lot of money saved and everyone will be desperate to go out and do stuff. And that's not to take away from the fact that, some people are going to be in for a tough time, but, we're talking about the average and we're talking about the overall economy here. So we could have a boom. I think the other point, Lo, is this thing about, so what do we do about the debt? And the fact that we're now questioning it. And we do have people, because next to that Financial Times article, there was an article from an asset manager who actually works in bonds. And so would arguably, would lose money if a lot of debt cancellation went on. But he was saying, we should be looking at cancelling some of this debt, because effectively, if the central bank owns the government debt, then all that's happened is that the government has written a little cheque to itself, so it owes itself money. So technically, if you did it in the right way, then you could probably get away with getting rid of it as a one-off. And you could maybe blame coronavirus, as long as most countries in the world did the same thing at the same time. Where it gets tricky is where this turns into the idea that, for example, the magic money tree people have, which is that you can just continuously do it, because that way does lie kind of Zimbabwe, kind of Weimar Republic sort of territory.
There we go. You ask John Stepek to end the show on a positive note. He literally ends with the Weimar Republic. Okay, well, we have all cashed in enough ideas for one day. Let's tot up our taking on this edition of The Week Unwrapped, and my thanks to today's bunch of bankers, Felicity, Tomiwa and John. Remember, in the meantime, to subscribe to this show for free, just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producers Sophie King and Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.